This is actually my only copy, so I just want to show it to you. This was one of the first books I published, and I was very careful about going to every single location that I write about in this book, and actually going through newspaper archives and doing research, because there's so many things that get repeated over and over again, and it turns out that they're not based on anything, or they're not true. So it's good to break that cycle. And I mentioned earlier that I had written an issue of the Legends and Lore of Illinois about Devil's Gate. And the Legends and Lore of Illinois was, I call it an electronic serial. It was a kind of a PDF. Every month there was a new issue about a different haunted place in Illinois. And that sort of evolved from a similar thing that I had done in Coles County when I was going to Eastern Illinois University. This is sort of a roundabout way of getting back to my original story. So I had started going to these places when I was in high school, but I didn't start writing about them until I went to Eastern Illinois University in Charleston. And the reason was because I had a lot of friends who were not necessarily from Charleston, but they were from the area. And so they knew a lot about the local legends, and they knew I was interested in that. And basically the only story from Coles County that anybody really knew about outside of Coles County was the ghost of Mary Hawkins at Pemberton Hall. Very famous story. I would say is probably one of the most famous stories to come out of Illinois. And if you go back and read some of the earliest books that talked about Illinois ghost stories, it's in there, along with Betcher's Grove. So I started finding out that there were all these haunted places that nobody had written about, you know. There was Ashmore Estates, although I didn't know that was what it was called at the time. Airtight Bridge, you know, St. Omer Cemetery. Some of you visited that when you went down there. There was Ragdoll Cemetery. I mean, at least half a dozen, if not 8 or 9 different haunted places or stories, you know, in and of the county. So I decided that I would do some research and I'd write down the stories and publish them online so people could download these PDFs. And originally, I'm really enamored with the idea of photo comics. They're very difficult to do, and they were so difficult to do that I kind of abandoned that idea in the first issue. I was going to take pictures of myself at the locations and then draw bubbles, like telling the story about it, but that didn't really work out, you know, the way that I thought. Well, some of the stories, I was going to tell you a little bit about Ashmore Estates, and I guess I will, but I know that you heard a lot about the history of it when you went down there. Scott's really good about, you know, telling that and everything. Well, basically, at the time that I encountered it, I started going to Eastern in 2000, the fall of 2000, and at the time it was owned by a man named Arthur Colclaser, who had bought it and he was trying to turn it into a house. And the problem was he didn't live in the area, so he would spend all kinds of money replacing the windows and everything, but he didn't live there, so he couldn't keep tabs on the place. So every time he would leave, people would come and break in there and bust out the windows and everything. So it was basically just cost him too much money. Hello. Basically just cost him too much money to keep doing that. So by the time some of my friends came to me and said, hey, you got to check out this abandoned place out in a cornfield somewhere, it didn't look like anybody had lived there or anybody was trying to restore the place. It just looked like this old abandoned building. So of course we all snuck in. And so that was one of the places that I wanted to write about for my newsletter. And there really was not a whole lot of information out there about it. Basically, there was a couple of websites that mentioned it. Even some of the history books of the county just sort of glossed over what it was. And I had to go back. I mean, people didn't even know when the place had closed down. I had to ask around, and people would tell me, Oh, it was in the early 80s sometime. So I went back to the newspaper archives on microfilm and literally sat there for hours scrolling through every single day of the early 1980s until I came across a headline about, you know, Ashmore Estate's closing. And so gradually I was able to piece together everything, you know, but basically a rough history of the place. And since that time, you know, the new owner, Scott Kelly, he bought the asylum right around the time that I wrote an issue of the Legends of Old Coles County about it. So basically he called me or emailed me because he saw the article online, and he said, hey, you know, we should talk because I'm thinking about buying the place. And since that time, he's done a lot of good work, and there are plenty of people who have volunteered, and really we have a solid history of that location. And I'll just give you a rough outline because you probably heard this before, but it was originally the Coles County Poor Farm. That was a place where indigent people, sometimes they were orphans, but a lot of times it was just elderly people that couldn't care for themselves anymore. Maybe families where the husband had died and the wife didn't have any means of income or anything. And so they would go, they would be kind of, I don't want to use the word sentenced, although they were called inmates at the farm, but basically a judge declared them legally indigent, and then they were like assigned to live on the farm. And they would work and try to keep up inside, you know, they would do whatever jobs they could. And there was a person there called an overseer of the poor who would live there, and he would kind of look after them. And basically that's what it was until about 1959, when poor farms really were phased out all over Illinois. And I believe to this day there's only a few remaining that are still standing. One is Ashmore Estates, the other one is called Sunset Haven down in Carbondale, and I think the one in Champaign County is still standing, but they all have sort of similar stories. And Ashmore Estates became Ashmore Estates because it was purchased by a private psychiatric hospital. That's what they turned it into. That didn't last very long. Then it became kind of a home for developmentally disabled people. But to make a long story short, there were probably about 100 deaths in the building during the time that it was in operation. And there was the original Poor Farm Cemetery was kind of north of the grounds, and it's gone. To this day, we kind of suspect where it was, but all the headstones are gone. Unfortunately, a lot of these older rural cemeteries, the headstones would get knocked over, kicked around and everything, until finally farmers just plowed them over. And that's probably what happened there. But there's another cemetery kind of in the woods south of the road there. And there's a lot of people that are unaccounted for. So maybe in that cemetery there's 50, 60 headstones that we can actually photograph and we know are there. But so we'll never know how many people actually died in the place. But normally people went there when they were elderly. So a lot of people lived out their remaining years there. So you can tell there's probably a lot of ghosts there. Now, as I was telling Ben earlier, I haven't experienced a lot there. I'm sort of, some people say they're kind of sensitive. I guess I'm kind of insensitive because I don't really ever experience very much. And everyone asks me, you know, well, have you ever seen anything? And I guess I have in odd situations, but I've never really seen anything when I'll just wait for that to pass. I've never really seen anything when I went to a place deliberately to see it. So I congratulate you guys on your success for all the stuff that you got at Ashmore Estates, because I'd never encountered anything there. But I had heard stories about it, and one of the former workers there that I interviewed back when I wrote an article about it, he would say that when he worked there in the 80s, people would see figures walking around at night, and everybody was supposed to be in the rooms, it was on lockdown, so nobody was supposed to be up walking around. So these nurses and employees would see pretty regularly, either someone out of the corner of their eye or somebody walking down the stairs, and they would approach them saying, hey, you can't be out of your room, and then nobody would be there. So he also told me a story that I recounted in that episode of Ghost Adventures. Did anybody see that episode?
Oh, yeah.
So some of you have, some of you haven't. Well, basically the story as he told me was that there was a woman that was admitted to the hospital that he said was possessed. He said he never believed in possession until he met this woman, and she was restrained with those leather restraints you see in movies. She actually broke those somehow and attacked him. So she had some kind of superhuman strength. And that was one of the stories that I told in Ghost Adventures. So that's a really interesting place. There's countless others. I kind of want to move on from Coles County, but Airtight Bridge is a favorite of mine. I don't know if you guys made it out there when you went down there, but basically a woman's torso was found there in 1980. She was missing her heads, hands, and feet. They'd been cut off, and she went unidentified for a long time. Basically, I think it was until the 1990s, and she was buried as a Jane Doe in the local cemetery for up until about a couple years ago. And it was kind of interesting. I'd written a couple articles about it, and one of the chapters in my book is one of the most complete accounts of a case that you're ever going to read. And a relative of this woman's daughter, this woman had a 2-year-old daughter when she disappeared. Now she's 30, I think, 30-something. And so I think it was her aunt or some relation to her contacted her daughter and got her in touch with me. And her daughter sent me